Cops beat the black woman's daughter into a coma. She took down the entire department. What if a mother's worst nightmare became the catalyst for an entire community's awakening? The fluorescent lights in Mercy General's ICU cast everything in harsh, unforgiving white. Diane Washington sat beside her daughter's bed, listening to the steady beep of machines that had become her daughter's voice for the past 3 days. Maya, just 32 and full of dreams about opening her own bakery, lay motionless beneath crisp hospital sheets. The bruises on her face told a story that made Diane's hands tremble every time she looked at them. 3 nights ago, Maya had been walking home from her evening shift at Henderson's Diner, the same route she'd taken safely for 2 years. Now tubes and wires connected her to life itself. While somewhere across town, 2 police officers were sitting at their desks, filing reports that painted a very different picture of what happened that Tuesday night. Diane had raised 4 children as a single mother, worked double shifts to put them through school, and taught them to respect authority. But staring at her unconscious daughter, something fierce and unbreakable stirred in her chest. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Diane Washington had lived in Millbrook for 37 years, watching the small Illinois town grow from a place where everyone knew everyone to something more complicated. She'd raised her children here, buried her husband here, and built a reputation as the woman who organized church fundraisers and never missed a school board meeting. Her neighbors trusted her steady judgment and quiet strength. Maya was her youngest, the one who'd inherited her father's gentle spirit and her mother's determination. After culinary school, she'd returned home with plans that made Diane's heart swell with pride. The little bakery Maya dreamed of would serve the kind of bread and pastries that brought families together. The way Diane's kitchen had always been the center of their world. The night everything changed started like any other. Maya had texted her mother at 9:15, "Closing up now, Mom. See you in the morning." She always sent that message, a small ritual that helped Diane sleep better. The diner sat just 6 blocks from Maya's apartment, a straight walk down Maple Street, through a neighborhood where porch lights stayed on and Mrs. Chen still left cookies for the mail carrier. Officer Derek Hastings and his partner, Officer Jim Morrison, had been patrolling that sector for 8 months. Hastings was 26, 3 years on the force, with a record that showed he'd been written up twice for excessive force complaints that were quietly filed away. Morrison, at 31, had a reputation for backing up his partner without asking questions. Their supervisor, Sergeant Phillips, had noted concerns about Hastings' approach during traffic stops, but those notes never seemed to make it into formal reviews. What happened on Maple Street that Tuesday night depended on who was telling the story. The official police report stated that Officers Hastings and Morrison observed a suspicious individual walking erratically and approached to investigate. It claimed Maya became combative when questioned, requiring the officers to subdue her for everyone's safety. The report mentioned no injuries beyond minor abrasions sustained during lawful arrest. But Maya's neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been pulling weeds in her front garden when she heard shouting. She watched from behind her fence as 2 officers confronted a young woman she recognized as the sweet girl from the diner. What she saw didn't match any report. She watched Maya raise her hands, heard her voice saying, "I'm just walking home," saw her pull out her phone to show them something, probably her ID or her mother's contact information. Mrs. Rodriguez thought later. What happened next would replay in Mrs. Rodriguez's mind for months. She saw Officer Hastings grab Maya's phone and throw it to the ground. She heard Maya say, "Please, that's my phone," and watched her take a step toward it. That's when everything exploded. Within seconds, Maya was on the ground, and Mrs. Rodriguez was calling 911 from her kitchen, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. The ambulance arrived 14 minutes later. Maya was unconscious, her breathing shallow, blood pooling beneath her head where it had struck the concrete. The paramedic's face told Mrs. Rodriguez everything she needed to know about how serious this was. At the hospital, Diane arrived to find doctors speaking in careful, clinical terms about brain swelling and induced comas and waiting to see. Maya's phone, they said, had been completely destroyed. Her purse was missing. The officers who'd brought her in spoke briefly with the attending physician about an unfortunate accident during a routine interaction. For 3 days, Diane sat beside Maya's bed, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall with mechanical precision. The doctors spoke cautiously about brain trauma and healing time and patience. Meanwhile, the police department's public information officer released a statement about an incident involving a subject who'd sustained injuries while resisting arrest. But Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the way Maya's voice had sounded, scared but polite, the way a young woman sounds when she's trying to de-escalate a situation she doesn't understand. She thought about Maya's destroyed phone and missing purse, and the 14-minute gap between when she called for an ambulance and when it arrived. She thought about the way Officer Hastings had stood over Maya's motionless body, not checking if she was breathing, not calling for medical help, just talking into his radio with the same tone he might use to report a fender bender. On the 4th morning, Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on Diane's front door. She'd brought homemade soup and a story that would change everything. She sat at Diane's kitchen table, the same table where Maya had planned her bakery business, and told Diane what she'd witnessed. Every detail, every word she could remember, every moment that didn't appear in any official report. When she finished, Diane sat quietly for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. She wasn't a woman who acted in anger or spoke without thinking, but she was a mother who'd watched her daughter breathe through machines for 4 days, while officers who'd put her there went home to their families each night. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Diane said finally, "would you be willing to tell someone else what you just told me?" The older woman nodded without hesitation. "Honey, I'll tell anyone who'll listen." That afternoon, Diane made her first phone call to the Millbrook Police Department. She asked to speak with someone about her daughter's case. The desk sergeant transferred her to a voicemail box. She left her name and number and waited. 2 days later, when no one had called back, she called again. This time, she was transferred to Officer Morrison, who told her the case was under investigation and she should be patient. Patience. Diane had been patient her whole life. But sitting beside Maya's hospital bed that evening, listening to machines breathe for her daughter, she realized that patience and justice weren't the same thing. The call from Maya's doctor came on a gray Thursday morning that felt heavy with unsaid things. Dr. Martinez spoke in the careful way doctors do when the news isn't terrible but isn't good either. Maya was showing signs of emerging from the coma, but there were concerns about memory and motor function. "Brain injuries are unpredictable," she explained to Diane. "We'll know more when she's more awake, but you should prepare yourself for a long recovery." For the first time in a week, Diane allowed herself to cry, not the silent tears she'd shed in hospital corridors, but the deep body-shaking sobs of a mother who'd almost lost her child. Maya would live, but the daughter who dreamed of opening a bakery might be different now, might struggle with things that had once come easily. That same afternoon, Mrs. Rodriguez called with news that made Diane's stomach drop. She'd been contacted by Officer Hastings, who'd stopped by her house in uniform to ask about what she might have seen that Tuesday night. He'd been polite, Mrs. Rodriguez said, almost friendly, suggesting that in the darkness and confusion, it would be easy for anyone to misremember details about such a chaotic situation. He kept saying how traumatic it must have been for me, Mrs. Rodriguez told Diane, and how sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we're upset. He reminded me that filing false reports is a serious crime, but he said it in such a nice way, like he was just looking out for me. Diane felt something cold settle in her chest. This wasn't how innocent officers behaved. This was intimidation wrapped in a smile and a uniform. The next morning brought another unwelcome surprise. The Millbrook Gazette ran a small story about the incident, buried on page 4. The headline read, Local woman injured during police encounter. The article, just 3 paragraphs long, relied entirely on information from the police department. It described Maya as having been involved in an altercation with officers and mentioned that she'd been hospitalized following injuries sustained during the incident. There was no mention of Mrs. Rodriguez's account, no questions about the missing purse or destroyed phone, no interview with family members, but it was the final sentence that made Diane's hands shake with anger. Police reports indicate the subject had been behaving erratically prior to the encounter, raising concerns about possible substance use. Maya had never touched drugs in her life. She barely drank wine at Christmas dinner. The woman who was fighting her way back from a coma had been working double shifts to save money for her dreams, not buying drugs on street corners. Diane called the newspaper that morning, asking to speak with the reporter who'd written the story. She was transferred to voicemail. When she called back 2 hours later, she was told the reporter was unavailable, but that they'd received her message. No one called back. That evening, as Diane sat beside Maya's bed, reading aloud from the cookbook they'd planned to use for the bakery, Maya's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they stared at each other in silence, and Diane watched her daughter's face work through confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like fear. "Mom." Maya's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed that morning. "I'm here, baby." "You're safe now?" Maya's eyes moved slowly around the hospital room, taking in the machines, the IV lines, the cast on her left arm that Diane hadn't mentioned yet. "What happened to me?" It was the question Diane had been dreading and preparing for. How do you tell your child that the people sworn to protect her had nearly killed her? How do you explain that her dreams might be delayed or changed because of 15 minutes on a sidewalk where she'd done nothing wrong? "You were hurt," Diane said carefully, "but you're getting better." Over the following days, as Maya grew stronger, fragments of that Tuesday night began returning to her. She remembered walking home from work, thinking about a new recipe she wanted to try. She remembered seeing the police car's headlights, feeling more relieved than worried because she'd always been taught that officers were there to help. She remembered being confused when they asked her to stop, but complying immediately because that's what her mother had taught her to do. The rest came back in pieces that didn't always fit together. Officer Hastings demanding to know what she was doing there, as if walking home from work was suspicious. His partner asking if she had ID, then becoming agitated when she reached for her purse. The moment when she'd pulled out her phone to call her mother, thinking that would help explain everything, and watched Officer Hastings knock it from her hands. "I said I was sorry," Maya told her mother, tears streaming down her face. "I kept saying I was sorry, and I tried to pick up my phone, and then—" She stopped, her breathing shallow. "I don't remember anything after that until I woke up here." Dr. Martinez had warned Diane that trauma memories could be unreliable, that the brain sometimes filled in gaps with fragments that felt real but might not be accurate. But listening to her daughter describe that night, Diane heard nothing that contradicted Mrs. Rodriguez's account. What she heard was a young woman who'd tried to be polite and cooperative and had nearly died for it. That night, alone in her kitchen, Diane made a decision that would change everything. She opened her laptop and began typing an email to the ACLU, the NAACP, and every civil rights organization she could find online. She wasn't a lawyer or an activist or someone who'd ever thought she'd be fighting her own town's police department. But she was a mother whose daughter had been broken by people who were supposed to protect her. And she was discovering that sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things. The subject line was simple. Request for help, police brutality case in Millbrook, Illinois. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. The response to Diane's emails came faster than she'd expected, but not from the organization she'd contacted. On a Monday morning, 2 weeks after Maya had awakened, Diane opened her door to find a woman in a crisp business suit holding a briefcase and wearing the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mrs. Washington, I'm Rebecca Hayes from the law firm of Morrison, Phillips and Associates. We represent the Millbrook Police Department. I was wondering if we might have a conversation about your daughter's unfortunate accident. The word accident hit Diane like a slap. She stood in her doorway, studying this woman who'd shown up uninvited with her briefcase full of papers and her practiced sympathy. My daughter wasn't in an accident, Diane said carefully. She was assaulted. Rebecca Hayes' smile flickered but held. I understand you're upset, Mrs. Washington. Any mother would be. That's why I'm here. The city would like to help with Maya's medical expenses. Hospital bills can be overwhelming, and we want to do the right thing. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. This is a settlement agreement that would cover all of Maya's medical costs, plus additional compensation for her pain and suffering. All we'd need is your signature and an agreement that this matter is resolved. Diane didn't need to read the papers to understand what was happening. They were trying to buy her silence before she could find a lawyer, before Maya was strong enough to tell her story, before Mrs. Rodriguez decided to go public with what she'd witnessed. How much? Diane asked. $50,000, Mrs. Washington. That's quite generous for a situation like this. $50,000. It was more money than Diane had ever seen at one time, enough to pay off Maya's student loans and help her start over somewhere safe. It was also, she realized, exactly what you'd pay someone to disappear quietly. I need to think about it, Diane said. Rebecca Hayes' smile tightened. Of course, but I should mention that offers like this don't stay on the table indefinitely. The longer these situations drag out, the more complicated they become for everyone involved. After the lawyer left, Diane sat at her kitchen table staring at the settlement papers. $50,000 would change their lives, but it would also mean that Officers Hastings and Morrison would never be held accountable. It would mean that the next young woman walking home from work might face the same violence Maya had, and there would be no consequences then either. That afternoon, Maya had her first physical therapy session. Diane watched her daughter struggle to walk 15 feet without assistance, watched her pause to rest because the brain injury had affected her balance and coordination. The occupational therapist was optimistic but honest. Maya would likely recover most of her abilities, but it would take months, maybe years. The dreams of opening a bakery would have to wait while she relearned things like measuring ingredients and remembering recipe sequences. I used to be able to make croissants from memory, Maya said that evening, frustration thick in her voice. Now, I can't remember if I've already added salt to the dough. It was then that Diane told her about the lawyer's visit and the settlement offer. Maya listened without interrupting, her face growing more troubled as the details unfolded. They think we'll just take the money and disappear, Maya asked finally. I think they're hoping we will. Maya was quiet for a long moment, staring out the hospital window at the parking lot where normal people went about their normal lives. Mom, what would Dad say about this? It was the first time either of them had mentioned David Washington since Maya's injury, but Diane knew immediately why her daughter was thinking of him now. David had been a man who believed in doing the right thing even when it was difficult, even when it cost him. He'd been the one who'd taught their children that integrity wasn't something you could compromise a little bit. Either you had it or you didn't. Your father would say that $50,000 is a lot of money, Diane said carefully. But he'd also say that some things are more important than money. That evening, after Maya had fallen asleep, Diane called Mrs. Rodriguez. The older woman had been getting pressure too, not from lawyers, but from neighbors who suggested that getting involved in police business was dangerous for someone in her situation. Mrs. Rodriguez had immigrated from El Salvador 30 years earlier, and she understood better than most how quickly a person could become unwelcome in their own community. I'm scared, Mrs. Rodriguez admitted, but I keep thinking about your daughter lying on that sidewalk and how those officers just stood there like she wasn't even human. What if I told you I found a civil rights lawyer who wants to take the case? Diane asked. What if you knew you wouldn't be standing alone? The call had come that afternoon from an attorney named James Chen with the Illinois Civil Rights Coalition. He'd received Diane's email through a referral network, and after reviewing the details, he wanted to meet with them as soon as possible. He specialized in police accountability cases and worked on contingency, meaning Diane wouldn't pay legal fees unless they won. "I've seen cases like this before," he'd told her during their phone conversation. "The pattern is always the same: excessive force, a cover-up disguised as an investigation, and settlement offers designed to buy silence. But you have something most victims don't have: a witness who's willing to speak up." Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment after Diane explained about the lawyer. "When do we meet with him?" "Wednesday afternoon." "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Rodriguez? Once we start down this path, there's no going back." "Honey," the older woman said, "I didn't survive a civil war and rebuild my life in America just to watch bullies in uniforms terrorize children. Count me in. Have you ever faced something like this? Share your experience in the comments." James Chen's office sat above a Chinese restaurant in downtown Springfield, 40 minutes from Millbrook, and it smelled faintly of ginger and determination. He was younger than Diane had expected, maybe 35, with tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much injustice for someone his age. But when he spoke about Maya's case, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that comes from winning battles that matter. "The police department has already made several critical mistakes," he explained, spreading photographs and documents across his desk. "They've claimed your daughter was combative, but medical records show all her injuries were to the back and side of her head, consistent with being struck while facing away or while on the ground. They've suggested possible drug use, but toxicology reports from the hospital show nothing, and they had to know those results before they made that statement to the press." Mrs. Rodriguez sat beside Diane, her hands folded carefully in her lap, occasionally nodding as Chen outlined what her testimony would mean. She'd already given him a detailed statement about what she'd witnessed, and he'd had it notarized and filed with the court. "The challenge," Chen continued, "is that this isn't just about getting justice for Maya. This is about changing a culture. Officer Hastings has 2 previous excessive force complaints that were never properly investigated. His partner, Morrison, has been involved in 4 incidents where suspects sustained injuries, but none were ever deemed unjustified. Sergeant Phillips, their supervisor, has a pattern of minimizing complaints and burying paperwork." Maya, stronger now after 3 weeks of recovery, spoke for the first time since they'd arrived. "What does that mean for other families?" Chen's expression softened as he looked at her. "It means that what happened to you has probably happened before, and it will happen again unless something changes. The settlement offer they made your mother isn't just about this case. It's about preventing a lawsuit that would expose their patterns and practices. The decision to reject the settlement and file a federal civil rights lawsuit made the front page of the Millbrook Gazette, though not in the way Diane had hoped. The headline read, "Family Rejects City's Generous Settlement Offer," and the article quoted unnamed sources, suggesting that the Washingtons were being manipulated by outside agitators looking to profit from tragedy. But something unexpected happened in the days following the article. Phone calls began coming to Diane's house, then to James Chen's office, from other families who'd had troubling encounters with the Millbrook Police Department. There was Jennifer Martinez, whose 16-year-old son had been roughed up during a traffic stop for driving through a white neighborhood. There was Robert Thompson, an electrician who'd been detained and searched after a neighbor called police about a suspicious person working on power lines in broad daylight, wearing his company uniform. Most troubling was the call from Sandra Wells, a nurse who'd tried to file a complaint against Officer Hastings 2 years earlier after he'd grabbed her roughly during a domestic violence call where she was the victim. Her complaint had been filed with Sergeant Phillips, who told her that officers sometimes had to use force in emotional situations and suggested she might have misunderstood Hastings' intentions. Each story alone might have seemed like a misunderstanding or an isolated incident. Together, they painted a picture of a police department where certain officers operated without meaningful oversight, where complaints disappeared into filing cabinets, and where victims were made to feel like the problem was their perception rather than officers' behavior. Chen filed the federal lawsuit on a Thursday morning in late September. The complaint named not just officers Hastings and Morrison, but also Sergeant Phillips and the city of Millbrook, alleging a pattern of constitutional violations and deliberate indifference to police misconduct. Within hours, the story was picked up by regional news outlets, and by evening, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune was calling Diane's house. The police department's response came swiftly and predictably. Chief Franklin held a press conference the next day, standing behind a podium flanked by American flags and speaking about the challenges facing law enforcement officers who risked their lives to protect the community. He called the lawsuit an unfortunate distraction and expressed confidence that an investigation would vindicate his officers' actions. But behind the scenes, cracks were beginning to show. Two patrol officers, uncomfortable with what they'd witnessed over the years but afraid to speak up, contacted Chen's office through an intermediary. They provided internal emails showing that Sergeant Phillips had received multiple complaints about Hastings' behavior, but had consistently downgraded them or recommended minimal discipline. More damaging was a recording system that department brass had forgotten about. Dash cameras in patrol cars that automatically activated during traffic stops. Hastings and Morrison had filed reports claiming their body cameras had malfunctioned during Maya's encounter. But the dash cam from their patrol car had captured audio from their radio microphones before, during, and after the incident. The audio was devastating. It recorded Hastings using racial slurs while describing Maya before they'd even approached her. It captured Morrison laughing about teaching her a lesson after she was unconscious on the ground. Most damning was an exchange where Hastings wondered aloud whether they should call an ambulance immediately or let her think about what happens when you don't respect police. When Chen played the audio for Diane and Maya in his office, the room fell silent except for the sound of Maya's quiet crying. This wasn't just excessive force or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate cruelty by people who'd sworn to serve and protect. "This changes everything," Chen said quietly. "With this evidence, the city won't be able to defend these officers. The question now isn't whether we'll win, but how quickly they'll want to settle and what reforms they'll agree to implement." Maya wiped her eyes and looked at her mother, then at Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd become like family over the past month. "I don't want money," she said. "I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. If you've been moved by this journey, subscribe for more heartfelt stories." The hearing room in the federal courthouse in Springfield was smaller than Diane had imagined, with worn wooden benches that reminded her of the church where she'd raised her children. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to Officer Morrison, she'd assured all parties, was a silver-haired woman in her 60s whose reputation for fairness had preceded her into the courtroom. Maya sat beside her mother, wearing the navy blue dress they'd bought for the occasion, her hands steady now in a way they hadn't been for months. The physical therapy had worked, and while she still tired more easily than before, the woman who dreamed of opening a bakery was finding her way back to herself. She'd been practicing recipes again, starting with simple things like chocolate chip cookies before moving on to the croissants that had once been her specialty. The city's attorneys had requested a settlement conference rather than proceeding to trial, which Chen explained was their way of admitting they couldn't defend the indefensible. The dashcam audio had been leaked to the press 3 days earlier, and Officer Hastings had already been fired. Morrison was suspended pending further investigation. Sergeant Phillips had quietly retired with full benefits, though Chen was pursuing a separate civil rights investigation that might change that arrangement. "Mrs. Washington," Judge Morrison said, Looking directly at Diane, I understand you've rejected several settlement offers in favor of seeking broader reforms. Can you explain to me what you hope to accomplish here? Diane stood, her hands clasped in front of her, thinking of the moment 4 months earlier when she'd sat beside Maya's hospital bed and decided that patience wasn't the same as justice. Your Honor, my daughter was nearly killed for the crime of walking home from work. But this case isn't really about what happened to Maya. It's about making sure it never happens to anyone else's child. She paused, glancing at Mrs. Rodriguez, who sat in the gallery behind them. We want accountability, yes, but we also want change. Real change. The settlement agreement they'd negotiated was unlike anything Millbrook had ever seen. Beyond the financial compensation for Maya, enough to cover her medical bills and fund the bakery she still dreamed of opening, the city agreed to implement sweeping police reforms. All officers would undergo implicit bias training. Body cameras would be mandatory, and any malfunction would result in automatic suspension. A civilian oversight board would review all use of force incidents. Most importantly, the city agreed to bring in an independent monitor to oversee the police department for the next 5 years. Officer Hastings faced federal criminal charges for violating Maya's civil rights. The FBI investigation had uncovered a pattern of misconduct that extended beyond Maya's case, and prosecutors were confident about securing a conviction. Morrison had agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for lesser charges, though his law enforcement career was over. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the one that couldn't be written into legal documents. The story of what had happened to Maya Washington had traveled far beyond Millbrook's city limits, shared and reshared on social media, discussed in living rooms and church basements throughout central Illinois. Other communities were asking hard questions about their own police departments, and other families were finding the courage to speak up about encounters they'd previously suffered in silence. Mrs. Rodriguez had become something of a local hero, the woman who'd chosen to speak truth even when it was dangerous. She testified before the city council about the importance of community members looking out for each other, and had been appointed to the new civilian oversight board. Her vegetable garden had become a gathering place for neighbors who wanted to talk about making their community safer for everyone. On a crisp October morning, 3 months after the settlement was finalized, Diane and Maya stood in the empty storefront that would soon become Maya's kitchen and bakery. The space smelled of sawdust and possibility, with tall windows that would let in perfect morning light for photographing the pastries Maya planned to feature on social media. "Are you sure about the name?" Maya asked, running her hand along the counter where she'd soon be rolling out croissant dough again. They debated calling it Sweet Dreams Bakery or Washington Family Kitchen, but had settled on something simpler. "I'm sure," Diane said, smiling. "This place is your dream, baby. Your name should be on the door." Maya pulled out her phone, a new one, since the original had been destroyed that night on Maple Street, and took a photo of the empty space. Later, she'd posted online with a caption about second chances and communities that support each other through difficult times. Her social media following had grown considerably during the months of legal proceedings, people drawn to her story of resilience and her mother's fight for justice. The bakery would open in December, just in time for the holidays. Maya had already been fielding orders for Christmas cookies and special occasion cakes. The local newspaper, under new management after the previous editor had been fired for biased coverage, had asked to do a feature story about the opening. As they locked up the storefront that morning, Diane thought about the journey that had brought them here. It hadn't been the path she'd expected when she'd raised 4 children as a single mother, working double shifts and believing that if you followed the rules and treated people with respect, the world would treat you fairly in return. Maya's case had taught her that justice wasn't something that happened automatically. It was something that had to be fought for, defended and protected by ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things. It had shown her that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with anger or violence, but with evidence and persistence, and the simple refusal to accept that things couldn't change. The key to Maya's new bakery was small and brass, worn smooth by previous owners who'd had their own dreams for this space. As Maya turned it in the lock, Diane thought about all the doors that had opened and closed over the past year. The hospital room where Maya had fought her way back to consciousness, the courthouse where they'd demanded accountability, and now this storefront where sweet things would be made and shared with a community that had learned something important about standing up for each other. Walking to their car, Maya slipped her arm through her mother's, and they moved forward together into whatever came next. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about courage, justice, and the power of community. Until next time, keep believing that ordinary people can create extraordinary change.